Good morning. My name is Alexis Jay, and I am a safeguarding professional with more than 30 years' experience of leading and scrutinising the protection of children and vulnerable adults. In July of last year, I was asked by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York to make recommendations to them on how to make safeguarding in the Church of England truly independent, including the scrutiny of safeguarding. And this is what I have done. As you know, I published my report a few days ago, and I hope that many of you have been able to read it for yourselves. If not, I would encourage you to do so, because I know from speaking to many people across the Church over the last 6 months just how much commitment there is to getting safeguarding right. I have told the Archbishops that I will make myself available to the response group which the Archbishops' Council has set up to progress my recommendations and other matters. However, I hope that in this short message I will assist you in your discussions about the future of church safeguarding. I would now like to clarify some aspects of my report. My work was not a review, nor an inquiry, nor a consultation. That is not what I was asked to do. The Archbishops asked me to make recommendations on how to make safeguarding and the scrutiny of it truly independent. This is important because the conclusions I have reached and the recommendations I have made are based on my professional experience, including the findings of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which I chaired for 7 years and which investigated the Church as part of its remit. Over the past 6 months, my team and I have met with many people from across the Church, a number of whom came forward of their own accord to give us their views. The purpose of this engagement was to better understand the current strengths and weaknesses of church safeguarding, in order to ensure that any new organisation retains what is working well and that it addresses what needs to change and improve. I spoke to members of the clergy at all levels and to members of the laity, church volunteers in parishes, safeguarding professionals and church officers. I also spoke to a significant number of victims and survivors of church abuse and others wrongly caught up in safeguarding processes. I hope very much that their needs, views and experiences will be at the forefront of your discussions. I would like now to turn to the substance of my report and briefly refer to its key points. Firstly, the need for the Church to act to improve safeguarding is urgent. I recognise fully that my recommendations represent significant change in how safeguarding is delivered and scrutinised. I know that many of those involved currently in safeguarding will wish to consider these carefully. However, my report has identified a collapse in trust and confidence, principally amongst victims and survivors, but not only by them. I set out multiple problems, including the variable interpretation of guidance, poor data collection, inconsistent supervision of safeguarding professionals, and inequity of funding across dioceses. One of the most problematic areas was the widely varying approaches taken to what constitutes a safeguarding concern. I believe it is imperative that everyone who considers my recommendations recognises a fundamental truth. Safeguarding in the Church today falls below the standards expected and set in secular organisations, which are required to follow statutory guidance. I think it is important here that I emphasise a point I made in my report. These weaknesses are not a reflection on the safeguarding professionals within the Church whom I have met. Rather, they reflect the context and processes which the Church expects these staff to work within. Given the period of time in which safeguarding has been a major concern for the Church, and given how long change can take, I have focused my report on addressing what practical steps are necessary to achieve radical change. This is why Part 4 of my report sets out what I believe to be the features of an effective, independent church safeguarding service. I do not suggest that any of these features are more important than any others. However, I do wish to draw your attention to one in particular. It is critical that the Church creates and upholds a person-centred culture, and that it fully embraces the paramountcy principle. This means that the welfare of the child or vulnerable adult must always come first and must always be acted upon by everyone, and not just those with a safeguarding role. No one should be absolved from this moral responsibility. Regrettably, I must advise you that this still does not happen everywhere within the Church. I should also warn you that I have, during this work, encountered the view that the Church's safeguarding problems are now largely historical. This is most definitely not the case. We engaged quite deliberately with people who had experienced safeguarding in the past 5 years. The weaknesses they identified to us were recent. Given how widespread shortcomings in current arrangements are, and the need for a change of culture, I believe that a new model of safeguarding is required, one which delivers a transfer of responsibility from the Church to 2 new, fully independent bodies. One of these bodies will deliver operational safeguarding, and the other will provide scrutiny of operational safeguarding. Their advice and decisions should be final and not merely advisory. They will be funded from Church resources which are charitable and therefore will need to be charities themselves. The responsibilities of each organisation are set out in part 5 of my report. Further information is contained in legal advice which I commissioned independently of the Church and have published. I wish to be clear about one important aspect of this model. Under it, safeguarding would continue to be delivered locally with safeguarding teams based in the diocese which they know and understand. It is essential that local knowledge and intelligence is maintained. In the course of our work, there was never any suggestion that diocesan safeguarding staff should be relocated or made part of a centralised team. I am clear also in my report that the Church must respect their employment rights and provide them with the appropriate support during change. I should also acknowledge that some change is already underway within the Church, not least as a consequence of recommendations which I made with my colleagues at the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. I am aware of this work and of the Pathfinder pilots in particular, and I am confident that these pilots would complement the work of the 2 new bodies which I have recommended. I would now like to turn to the conclusions and recommendations in my report. My conclusions are based on considerably more than what I heard during my visits to the 6 dioceses and other engagement activity. They draw on previous investigations into the Church of England, on audits the Church itself commissioned, and on documents and other material it provided on request. For the avoidance of doubt, I and my team received the cooperation we requested and expected from the Church, and we are grateful for the assistance provided by all involved. Rather than go through all of my conclusions, I will select some of the key points. Firstly, we want to acknowledge that the Church has, over many years, tried to improve its safeguarding and governance. This includes the creation of the National Safeguarding Team and increased funding. However, the slow pace of change and the troubled relationship between the Church and victims and survivors must also be acknowledged. Many of those I spoke to considered the current situation to be an all-time low. I have come to the conclusion that while the 42 diocese model may serve the Church very well in many respects, it is simply not compatible with the development of a trusted, high quality and accountable system for safeguarding. There is also too much scope for inconsistency, which can lead to unfair and unequal treatment and variable responses to safeguarding concerns and allegations. And there is too much scope for conflicts of interest, which undermine trust and confidence amongst victims and survivors and those subject to complaints. Processes are often lengthy, lack transparency, and communication in general is seen as very poor. It is imperative that the Church recognises that these weaknesses in its operational safeguarding will persist, however much scrutiny is applied, until the delivery of safeguarding is removed from the diocesan management structure and placed into an independent body. These weaknesses can have a devastating effect both on victims and survivors and on people subject to a complaint. Through this work, I have heard repeatedly the phrase, the weaponising of safeguarding. I wish to be clear that I've heard this from a significant number of individuals, including victims and survivors, members of the clergy, and from the laity. And it would be foolhardy to dismiss this concern lightly. That is one of the reasons I have concluded that the Church must standardise its definitions of safeguarding and ensure they comply with the statutory definitions. It must also challenge erroneous beliefs about safeguarding which continue to be held. For example, we heard from a number of people that safeguarding should be rooted in Scripture, and that being a practicing Christian should be a prerequisite to holding a safeguarding role in the Church. Finally, I would like to touch on my recommendations to the Archbishop's Council. I have recommended that the General Synod pass a measure with parliamentary approval and royal assent which creates two duties. One, to refer all safeguarding matters to the independent bodies, and a second, to implement all the decisions of these bodies. I have also recommended that an independent organisation oversees the establishment of these two new bodies. I have made further recommendations on how the bodies should be financed by the Church and how their independence should be guaranteed from the outset. There will, I am sure, be many questions about how these two independent charities in this model would be established and about the nature of their relationship with the Church and with each other. Some of these will be addressed in the legal advice I mentioned earlier, which is available on the website. Other questions are for the Church to consider, depending on how it decides to proceed. In conclusion, I would encourage you to view these recommendations as they are intended, a package of reforms which, if implemented collectively, will deliver truly independent safeguarding, which will be subject to truly independent scrutiny. Thank you.